Hi everybody, I'm David with Game-Refraction. I'm here with Todd at Sloane Concepts. Tell us a little bit about your booth here.
Well, it all started, I think, when I was a young chap, as far as watching all the black and white science fiction movies my brother and I could get our hands on. I'm also into the graphic arts. I own an ad agency here in Calgary.
All right.
So it's always been, creative has always been part of my life. I started with the sculpting probably about 6 years ago. It started out by doodling all the wonderful old movie robots and sci-fi ray guns, Flash Gordon, and all those kinds of old retro movies. From the pencil works and from the illustrations, I would take those into seeing what they would look like in 3 dimensions. So thus starting the sculptures of the robots and of the ray guns themselves. They're all made up of, 90% of them are all vintage parts. So it's vintage typewriters from the 40s and 50s and 60s, household items, egg beaters, mixers, radios, television parts, car parts, all vintage parts, usually from, like I said, from the 40s to the 60s, and then reassembling them into the sculptures themselves.
Finding parts for machines and devices for that old must be difficult to find. How did you find a source for those parts?
I might end up being on that hoarder show, to be quite honest. So I have a lot of different parts because I take them all apart, of course, so then it expands into more, I'm needing more and more space. So it's antique stores, yard sales, eBay, finding them in different parts in different ways, and then basically taking them apart and then reassembling them. There's everything from musical instruments, as I said, to TV to car parts.
Sounds like it would be a full-time job just shopping for parts.
Yeah, and I found them in a lot of interesting places. One time we were out in the woods hiking, and we came across this burnt-out skidoo in the middle of nowhere in the trees. It was totally burnt out and looked had it been there forever, probably from the 70s or 80s. And luckily I had bolt cutters. I seem to do that a lot now, is having wire cutters and bolt cutters with me all the time, because then I stripped all the cables out of it and then introduced it into a piece of a sculpture.
So how many years have you been doing this?
More full-time, about 6 years.
Okay.
6 years now.
Do you generally know what you're looking for parts? You just take anything and everything that might be of value?
Yes. That's why I sort of need a warehouse now. So yes, anything of interest. And again, trying to keep it true to what I think is the art form, is that vintage look, industrial design look. So always trying to keep it in that time period, kind of nothing past 1969 kind of.
So when you go to assemble a sculpture, do you have a general idea on paper what you want?
A little bit. I tend to doodle them out, more of the concept, not necessarily what the finished piece is going to look like. So if I'm trying to do something like a couple of the pieces, I call them Vogue bots, so more related to that old 1950s, the way they used to illustrate fashion design. Okay. You know, the big flowing skirts and the sort of contorted faces. And bodies, and then turning them into sculptures. So finding that old fabric, I know I've used 1950s women's girdles, cut them down and re-sewn them to fit the sculptures. So again, finding that true vintage look and feel with all the parts I use. But yes, tend to pencil them out, doodle away, and then try and find the parts that match.
Do you ever have one sculpture where you just can't find the part for, and it sits and sits and sits, and eventually you're like, that part right there?
Yeah, it works. Absolutely. And it is, so I do have a few on the go at the same time for that reason. Sometimes you just can't finish it, or it is not working, and then you'll come across this aha moment of you finding something that goes, that'll work perfectly.
What's the biggest sculpture you've done?
Biggest one, they all range probably around the sort of 2 feet, 20 to 28 inches. That seems to be where sort of my comfort level is. I know a few people have said, why don't you do a big one? And it's like, that it works out for the parts themselves. Like a lot of people enjoy trying to figure out what those little pieces are. So scale-wise, it just seems to work out for me, that scale.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you very much.